Max Verstappen has just won his fourth F1 driver's title on the bounce. However, this one hasn't been without its mistakes, according to Ferrari boss Frederick Vasseur, who says that he's made more mistakes this season than he usually would. So I thought in this video we would test that theory. How many mistakes has Max Verstappen made this season? How many mistakes have Red Bull made this season? And overall, how many points have these mistakes cost Max Verstappen's driver's title? Could he have won it any earlier? This video serves as somewhat of a follow-up video to this video right here that I made discussing Lando Norris and how many points he had lost this season. You guys seem to love that one. So similarly to that one, we will take a look at how many points Max Verstappen lost, how many points Red Bull lost, add them together, add it to his current total, and see how many points Max Verstappen could have scored this season. We'll also take a look at how these incidents affected Lando Norris's points total throughout the season and compare and contrast at the end his gap to him. So to start with, our first incident, let's kick it right the way back to round 3 of the season at the Australian Grand Prix, where on lap 3 of the race, Max Verstappen's brakes failed. He had a rear left brake issue that ended up exploding when he came into the pit lane. Now in this race he essentially started with the brakes binding. It ended up coming to a head on lap 3. He had already been overtaken by Carlos Sainz at this point. It's difficult to say whether or not Max would have won this race because, you know, we didn't actually see the pace that he had throughout the race. What I'll say is he definitely would have come in the top 2, so we'll put it down as a minus 18 points for Max, but it definitely could have been 25 on that day. I would also say that this is Red Bull's fault, whilst it's entirely luck-based essentially. It does come down more to the team than it does to Max. Also, in this scenario where Max Verstappen did finish first or second in this race, then Lando would have lost 3 points on that day. At the Austrian Grand Prix, this was obviously the start of the sort of Lando Norris versus Max Verstappen controversy that ended up continuing throughout the remainder of the season this year. The big part of that race that people will generally remember is, of course, them coming together at turn 3, obviously costing Max Verstappen a few places, costing Lando the entire race. But the part of the race that people maybe would forget, which is easily done, is that Red Bull had a slow pit stop which allowed Lando Norris to close the gap up to Max Verstappen. Then Max actually locked up at turn 4, again allowing Lando to get a bit closer, and then obviously it came to a head, the two collided, and it definitely had a much more negative effect on Lando Norris than it did on Max Verstappen. Now, of course, the actual contact itself, it's up for a bit of debate. Depending on who you support, you'll probably see it in a different way. The way I see it from a more neutral perspective is that it's kind of a 50-50 incident, maybe a little bit more on Max. And what it resulted in was Max essentially losing second place in that race, because I do think towards the end of that race, Lando Norris probably would have ended up getting past him. So Max basically dropped from second place down into 5th, losing 8 points. And despite the Red Bull slow pit stop bringing Max and Lando closer together in the race at this point, I would say it's more Max Verstappen's fault that the contact happened. But what this actually meant in terms of the championship was actually a big gain for Max, because Lando lost 25 points in this scenario. Assuming he would have gone on to win this race, he ended up dropping down and DNFing. So it's actually a net gain for Verstappen for this event to have occurred. The Hungarian Grand Prix was a difficult one for Max Verstappen. After going wide at the first corner, he was deemed to have overtaken Lando Norris off track. The team ordered him to give the position back, and this started a somewhat head-loss afternoon for Max Verstappen on that day. The team then allowed themselves to get undercut on 2 occasions, the first one by just Lewis Hamilton, the second one by both Lewis and Charles Leclerc. This resulted in Max basically getting further and further more heated in the car. We started hearing a few discussions between him and GP that were getting a bit more heated as the race went on. And then in the final stint, recovering from that undercut from the Ferrari and the Mercedes, using the fresher tyres, he overtook Charles Leclerc. And then when it came to overtaking Lewis Hamilton, he kind of made the move a little bit too late, locked up, ended up going straight on, and then Lewis kind of turned in and hit him. I think that one was fairly deemed to be Max Verstappen's fault. And then he ended up dropping back behind Charles Leclerc. He effectively dropped from what would have been a 3rd place finish down into 5th. that lost him 5 points on that day. And that one was Max Verstappen's fault. As much as Red Bull kind of allowed the undercuts to happen, it did seem that Max definitely did have the pace to come home in P3 on that day and didn't end up doing so. At the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, a setup change that Red Bull made between practice 3 and qualifying ended up hindering Max Verstappen massively during the race. He said after the race that basically the setup change that they made him lose confidence in himself and in the car, and when you're on a street track, of course, you need maximum commitment at every corner despite the walls being all around you, and Max just felt like he didn't have that on that day. Of course, on that weekend we saw one of Sergio Perez's best drives of the year. He looked like he was going to come home at least in the top 3 on that day, until he had that massive crash with Carlos Sainz on the last lap. So I think it's fair to say, given where Checo probably should have finished if he didn't crash, then Max probably could have come home in P2 just behind Oscar Piastri, and that would have been an 8-point gain for Max on that day. And that one I would say goes down to Red Bull for the setup change. It's difficult to say, it's a sort of 50-50 toss-up. For the sake of the video, I'll say Red Bull, but it's impossible to really say for sure who made the final call on that setup. And that one also allowed Lando Norris to gain an extra 2 points on Max Verstappen. We then come to the Mexican Grand Prix. I'd say it's still fairly fresh in the memory what happened on that day. Essentially, Max Verstappen running Lando Norris off at turn 4 in Mexico, and then later in the lap, the sort of worst of the two incidents when he just sort of ran Lando off at a corner where you never normally see moves made. In terms of my opinion on the penalties that he got on that day, 20 seconds of penalties, I feel like 10 seconds probably would have been more fair. But given the steward's ruling and what happened on that day, the 20 seconds would have taken Max up from 6th place finish in the race up to P4, and that is an extra 4 points gain that he could have made, and that one is Max's fault. I wouldn't say it's for certain, but there is a chance that Lando Norris could have won that race if Max didn't sort of put these blocking manoeuvres on him, and I definitely think that this wasn't a mistake by Max Verstappen. He was definitely calculated in the fact that he knew that given the way the championship was sort of turning at that stage of the season, he just needed to do everything in his power to stop Lando Norris from winning. It definitely worked in his favour what he did on that day. Whether or not you see it as fair, then that's completely up to you. I'm not going to stop you on your opinions of that one. And moving finally on to the Las Vegas Grand Prix, I will admit that this one is a bit of a reach, but I think that Max showed the pace in the first stint that he probably could have finished on the podium that day, and perhaps he had taken the foot off the gas a bit towards the end of the race, knowing that he was going to win the championship anyway, kind of went into damage limitation mode, came home in P5. I do think that he probably could have finished in front of the Ferraris, but again, to reiterate, this one is a bit of a reach. And because of this, he lost 5 points in the championship that day, and that one would be Max's fault. So, with all that being said, how many points did Max Verstappen lose this season down to his own incidents and Red Bull's mistakes? Drumroll please. It's 49 points, and this can be divided up into 23 points lost by Max Verstappen and 26 points lost by Red Bull. And you might be thinking, 49 points? That's quite a substantial amount. But what you need to remember in these situations is that in losing these 49 points, Lando Norris actually would have gained 20 points on Max Verstappen as well. So the actual net difference in terms of the championship between Verstappen and Norris was actually only 29 points, which isn't all that much. This would have seen Verstappen currently, as of the Qatar Grand Prix, on 478 points, and Lando Norris on 369. So it is just fair to say that all of these incidents that Max was involved in, it just really didn't affect his season. He wouldn't have won the championship any earlier, and if anything, it benefited him. He seemed to be able to nullify the sort of momentum that Lando and McLaren were bringing into the last few races of the season by just kind of putting them off their stride, and it really did work for him. And I think that Max is just always ready to kind of push the limit, go even over the limit in the name of winning. It's never like careless or reckless, it's always calculated, it always makes sense for him to do it in the bigger picture. He knew to win the championship, he just had to make sure that Lando Norris wasn't winning races, and he did exactly that. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't around to watch Michael Schumacher in his prime, But from what I've seen in videos, what I've read online, what I've heard from my parents, is that he had this similar winning mentality of winning at all costs. You know, we had Michael Schumacher taking out Damon Hill to win the championship, attempting to take out Jacques Villeneuve to win the championship. When you look at Max Verstappen, it sounds quite similar. And Max definitely doesn't care how he's perceived by the media in terms of how they look at these incidents and how they break them down. All he cares about is winning. And whether you like it or not, and whether you like him or not, Max Verstappen is always going to be likely to win if he's given a car capable of winning, because he is going to push these boundaries and he is going to push the rule book. And what the history books will show is Max Verstappen winning all these races and winning all these championships. It's not going to show these nuances that we discuss.